Timothy Caldwell's early years were marked by loss, hardship, and an unsettling calmness that would soon raise suspicions in those around him. Born to a soldier father and a sickly mother, his early life was consumed by the devastating impacts of war and disease. His father, a Union soldier, had perished in the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861, while his mother, Martha Caldwell, succumbed to consumption in the harsh winter of 1865. Left an orphan at the age of 8, Timothy had no choice but to rely on distant family for survival. Timothy's arrival at the Caldwell farm in the spring of 1866 was less a homecoming than a new chapter in a life fraught with tragedy. His uncle, Thomas Caldwell, a man hardened by the ravages of the Civil War, was not eager to take on the responsibility of raising a child. His wife, Sarah Caldwell, had long been bitter and resentful, struggling with childlessness and the lingering shadow of grief. However, despite their reluctance, they agreed to take in the orphaned boy. Timothy arrived with little more than a small cloth bag containing some meager possessions. His pale blue eyes, large for his face, gave him a hauntingly mature appearance for someone so young. Thomas and Sarah did not know it then, but their nephew's presence would soon become a harbinger of misfortune for the Caldwell farm. The Caldwell farm, situated in a secluded valley about 15 miles south of Sedalia, Missouri, was once a thriving piece of land, but the aftermath of the war had left it in disrepair. The death of James Caldwell, Timothy's father, had left the farm in a state of abandonment, and Martha's passing left little hope for its restoration. Now the burden of the land fell upon Thomas, whose labor was insufficient to bring the farm back to life. He found himself struggling to maintain the property and care for the animals. Sarah, weary and growing more bitter with time, showed little interest in Timothy's upbringing. She took no joy in motherhood, and Timothy's arrival did little to change her hardened disposition. In this cold, unloving environment, Timothy's behavior went largely unnoticed until something began to feel off about him. Timothy's arrival on the farm marked the beginning of what would become a series of strange, unsettling events. To those who knew him, there was something unnervingly peculiar about the boy. He was quiet, remarkably polite, and showed none of the typical signs of childhood playfulness. Instead of running around with other children or exploring the wilderness, Timothy threw himself into work with the intensity of someone far older. His stepmother, Sarah, would often comment on how Timothy never seemed to tire. He worked with an unyielding focus, his pale blue eyes never wavering from the task at hand, whether it was tending to the livestock, harvesting crops, or completing chores on the farm. Mrs. Elenana Patterson, who lived on the neighboring farm, was the first to take note of Timothy's odd behavior. She often observed him from her porch as he worked tirelessly in the fields, always with the same stoic expression and relentless work ethic. "It's like watching a little machine," she confided to her husband one evening. "He never stops, no rest, no play." It was as though Timothy had no need for breaks, no desire to do anything other than work. Children, after all, were meant to play, to laugh, to run. But Timothy seemed completely devoid of this instinct. Neighbors soon realized that Timothy did not exhibit the usual playfulness of a child his age. He never seemed interested in the other children around Sedalia, and when the local kids tried to approach him, they often found him distant and unresponsive. It was as if he lived in a world of his own, with no interest in the laughter or joy that others his age found so naturally. More disturbingly, Timothy's interactions with animals left many feeling uneasy. His aunt, Sarah, noticed that the boy seemed especially drawn to the livestock, handling them with a cold efficiency that defied the usual warmth associated with childhood affection for animals. Timothy did not pet the animals or engage with them as children typically do. Rather, he observed them as if studying them, his attention entirely focused on their movements, their behavior, and their reactions. There were reports from nearby farms that Timothy had been seen in the vicinity when farm animals began to die under strange circumstances. Animals on Mrs. Patterson's farm, especially her chickens, grew agitated and disturbed whenever Timothy was nearby, as though they could sense something unsettling in his presence. Though no one could explain it at the time, there was a growing sense of unease around Timothy's behavior. No one could point to anything directly wrong, but something about the boy's unblinking eyes, his lack of emotional response, and his unfathomable ability to work tirelessly made those who observed him uneasy. The first death that would haunt Sedalia County was the little girl Mary Fletcher, a 5-year-old girl known for her bubbly personality and playful nature. Mary was the daughter of the town's blacksmith, and her laughter was a familiar sound to the local farmers. She spent her days wandering near the banks of Willow Creek, a shallow stream that ran through the valley. It was a common enough sight to see children playing by the creek, their parents often paying little mind to the occasional drowning risks in rural communities where children were left unsupervised. It was a hot afternoon in August 1866 when Timothy Caldwell found Mary's lifeless body by the creek. He was the first to arrive at the Fletcher home, pale and visibly shaken, though he remained remarkably composed for a child of his age. His clothes were damp, and his face was drawn in what seemed to be genuine distress. Timothy's voice, steady and calm, conveyed a sense of urgency when he told Mary's mother, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." His tone was unremarkable, as if he had simply stumbled upon an unfortunate accident, not the lifeless body of a little girl. When a search party was assembled to investigate, they found Mary's body lying face down in only a few inches of water, her dress caught on a submerged branch. Despite the fact that the creek was shallow, Mary had drowned, and the circumstances seemed to suggest that she had been playing near the water when the accident occurred. There was no sign of foul play, just a tragic accident, as children often drowned when left unattended near water. However, it was the details that Timothy provided that troubled Dr. Samuel Harding, who was summoned to the scene. The boy's description of the scene was unusually precise. He could describe the exact position of Mary's body, the way her dress had been snagged on the branch, and the color of the water around her face. This attention to detail seemed far beyond the capabilities of a child who was just discovering a lifeless body, especially considering the fact that Timothy claimed to have found it while searching for a lost calf. The confusion grew as Timothy's account of the calf's whereabouts came into question. While Thomas Caldwell, Timothy's uncle, confirmed that the calf had gone missing that morning, he also revealed that the calf had been found alive 2 days later, grazing far from the creek. It raised troubling questions about why Timothy was near the creek in the first place, and whether his presence was purely coincidental. Despite the questions raised by Dr. Harding and Mrs. Patterson's growing concerns, Timothy was praised for finding the body and alerting the Fletcher family to the tragedy. At the funeral, Timothy sat solemnly with his aunt and uncle, his head bowed respectfully during the service. But as the mourners wept, Elena Patterson observed something that would gnaw at her for days to come. When Mary's mother collapsed in grief, when the sight of the small coffin reduced even grown men to tears, Timothy's expression remained unchanged. He sat with his head bowed, but his blue eyes were dry and unfeeling, watching the scene around him with a clinical detachment. This moment marked the beginning of an unsettling pattern that would grow more disturbing with each death. Timothy Caldwell's apparent lack of emotion in the face of tragedy, coupled with his chilling precision in recalling details of the death, was only the beginning of the mystery that would grip Sedalia County for months to come.
In June of 1866, Dr. Samuel Harding, the only formally trained physician in the remote farming community outside Sedalia, Missouri, first encountered Timothy Caldwell. Dr. Harding had spent his career traveling between small towns, treating the sick and injured, and was well accustomed to the emotional landscapes of rural life. His reputation had been built not only on his medical knowledge, but also on his keen understanding of human behavior, honed during his time treating both Union and Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. By the time he met Timothy, Dr. Harding had witnessed the darker sides of human nature, brutality, despair, and suffering, yet nothing had prepared him for the unnerving calmness of the young boy who stood before him. Timothy arrived in town with his uncle, Thomas Caldwell, to gather supplies for the farm. Dr. Harding had seen hundreds of children in his time, and while some were shy and others were boisterous, Timothy was unlike any child he had encountered. The boy was polite, respectful, and composed. Too composed, Dr. Harding noted in his journal. He was quiet, making eye contact with the physician in a way that seemed almost clinical, as if the child were the one doing the examining rather than being examined. Harding made a quick mental note of the boy's behavior, finding it slightly off-putting. The child spoke with a clarity that seemed beyond his years, Harding wrote. He did not fidget, as children often do in the presence of strangers, nor did he seem overwhelmed by the unfamiliar surroundings of the town. His manners were impeccable, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. It was as if he was studying me as much as I was studying him. Despite the boy's perfect composure, Harding could not shake the sense that something was wrong. He recalled Timothy's direct responses, the way he seemed entirely unaffected by his surroundings, as if he were more at ease in the world of adults than that of his peers. But it was only a fleeting impression at the time, one Dr. Harding could not fully understand. Harding's unease would fester as Timothy's presence in the community grew, though the doctor could not put his finger on the source of his discomfort. The boy's demeanor was unnervingly calm, and his interactions with other people seemed calculated. There were no signs of the typical childhood exuberance, no laughter, no play, and no carefree moments that children typically revel in. Instead, Timothy approached life with an eerie focus and a peculiar stillness that set him apart from the other children in Sedalia. Yet, because he never outwardly misbehaved or caused trouble, most dismissed their discomfort as simply the imagination of an overcautious adult. The deaths that followed. The first unsettling death, that of young Mary Fletcher, occurred soon after Timothy's arrival, and it marked a beginning of a chilling pattern. When Dr. Harding was called to investigate the drowning, he was struck by how Timothy seemed to be unusually involved in the discovery of the body. Timothy's detailed account of where he had found Mary's body, including the exact position of her limbs and the state of her clothing, felt like something that an adult might offer, a precision not typical of a child who had only just discovered the scene. His calm demeanor, despite the tragedy, and his uncanny ability to recall the scene in such vivid detail left Harding with a sense of growing discomfort. Then came the death of Henrik Len, an elderly Norwegian immigrant who had been found at the base of Devil's Bluff. The circumstances surrounding Henrik's fall were strange. He was known to frequent visit the bluff, a place he knew intimately. Yet despite his experience and familiarity with the terrain, Henrik had somehow fallen to his death, a scenario that seemed almost impossible given his knowledge of the area. Timothy, once again, was the one to discover the body, and his explanation for Henrik's fall seemed oddly rehearsed, as if he had anticipated the explanation. Timothy suggested that perhaps Henrik had been swarmed by bees, causing him to lose his footing and tumble down the cliff. Though this explanation made sense at first glance, it failed to account for the fact that the bees, which should have been spread out over Henrik's path, had instead congregated around the area where his body had landed. Dr. Harding, ever the skeptic, began to question the boy's involvement in these deaths. When he examined the scene more closely, he found that the beehives at the top of the bluff had not been disturbed, and the bees were not agitated. It was as if the bees had been deliberately directed to a small area around the base of the bluff. And yet again, Timothy's calm demeanor struck Harding as being out of place. Where others saw a tragic accident, Harding began to wonder if there was something more to these events than met the eye. The third death, of Jacob Mills, took place under even stranger circumstances. Jacob, a 6-year-old boy, had gone missing while playing in the woods near his family's cabin. Timothy, once again, was present during the search and was the one who eventually led the search party to an abandoned well where Jacob's body was found. What was peculiar was that Timothy seemed to know exactly where to look. He led the group to the well without hesitation, despite the fact that the area was difficult to navigate, even for long-time residents. When questioned about his knowledge of the well's location, Timothy claimed he had heard the sound of crying, but the well had been so well concealed by brush and debris that it seemed impossible for Timothy to have discovered it on his own, unless he had already known it was there. Dr. Harding was further disturbed by the way Timothy behaved during Jacob's final hours. While the Mills family kept vigil around their dying son, Timothy sat silently in the corner of the cabin. Harding, positioning himself in a way that allowed him to observe Timothy without being noticed, saw something that unsettled him deeply. Timothy did not appear to be grieving. Instead, he sat with an almost scientific interest, watching Jacob as he struggled to stay alive. His eyes were fixed on Jacob's labored breathing and pale skin, his expression one of detached curiosity. When Jacob finally died, Timothy's reaction was chilling. There was no visible grief, no sorrow, only a faint look of satisfaction that seemed to play across his face. Dr. Harding, now deeply troubled, began documenting these events in his journal. He wrote about the oddness of Timothy's behavior, his calmness in the face of tragedy, his detachment from the suffering of others, and his uncanny involvement in each of the deaths. Harding began to suspect that Timothy was not just a passive observer, but may have been actively involved in the events that had been unfolding. His suspicions were further confirmed as more accidents and deaths began to occur in the community, all centered around the Caldwell farm. As the pattern of strange accidents and unexplained deaths continued to unfold, Dr. Harding's concern grew. His journal entries became more frequent and more detailed as he documented the increasingly bizarre occurrences surrounding Timothy. He began to notice unsettling patterns. Timothy's presence seemed to coincide with every death, and his behavior was always eerily calm and collected. The boy's explanation for each incident was always logical, always plausible, but always lacking in emotional response. Harding struggled with the possibility that a child, especially one so young, could be capable of such dark actions. The prevailing belief in 19th century medicine was that children were inherently innocent, their actions shaped by external influences rather than their own nature. The idea that Timothy Caldwell might be a cold-blooded killer was inconceivable, and yet Harding could not ignore the mounting evidence. Timothy's knowledge of anatomy, his unsettling curiosity about death, and his lack of remorse for the lives he had caused to be lost painted a disturbing picture. Harding's growing suspicion was matched by his increasing discomfort with the boy's presence. He had witnessed the violence and cruelty of war firsthand, but the cold, calculating nature of a child like Timothy was something entirely different, something new and terrifying. Harding began to realize that despite Timothy's outward appearance as a model child, obedient, polite, respectful, there was something fundamentally wrong with him. The child seemed to be a walking contradiction, a polite and seemingly well-behaved boy with a mind capable of cruelty and violence beyond anything Harding had ever encountered. Dr. Harding's investigation, though still informal, had begun. He could not yet prove that Timothy was directly responsible for the deaths, but the growing body of evidence suggested that Timothy was more than just an unfortunate witness to tragedy. He began to make careful observations, documenting every interaction, every word, and every action. As the deaths continued to stack up, Dr. Harding's suspicions would only deepen. The question was no longer whether Timothy had anything to do with the deaths, but rather how far his manipulations had gone and what he might do next.
Timothy Caldwell's fascination with death and suffering began long before the tragic events that would mark his early years. As the community's physician, Dr. Samuel Harding had seen his fair share of children who were curious about the world around them, often asking questions about animals, plants, or the human body. But Timothy's questions were different, unnervingly precise, and disturbingly focused on the darker aspects of life, specifically injury, death, and pain. While other children were content with play and innocence, Timothy's curiosity led him to inquire about matters that should have been beyond the scope of a child's understanding. His questions about anatomy and the mechanics of injury were detailed and unsettling. "What happens when you cut someone's arm off?" he once asked Dr. Harding, casually, as if asking about the weather. The boy's tone, devoid of any emotion or shock, made Harding feel uncomfortable, especially given the boy's young age. Timothy's curiosity did not stop at theoretical questions. He began conducting crude experiments on animals, often capturing local wildlife and subjecting them to various forms of injury to observe their responses. Timothy's fascination with how creatures reacted to pain and death seemed almost scientific in its precision, yet there was no trace of empathy or care for the animals he used as subjects. It wasn't enough for Timothy to simply observe. He wanted to understand the mechanics of suffering, the duration of pain, and the way life ebbed away from a body. Dr. Harding's initial suspicions about Timothy's unusual behavior were confirmed when he began noticing patterns in the deaths of local animals. Farmers had been reporting strange accidents involving livestock, such as broken necks in chickens, strangled calves, and injured pigs that were left to suffer. While some of these incidents were chalked up to predation or accidents, the precision with which they occurred, along with the peculiar timing, began to raise red flags. When Timothy spoke about animals, he would often describe their suffering with a clinical detachment. He seemed to be more concerned about how the animal's body responded to injury rather than the morality of causing that injury in the first place. One day he casually mentioned to Dr. Harding that when you squeeze a rabbit's neck just right, they stop moving in about 5 minutes, but they're still conscious for a while. Timothy's words were delivered with such casual interest that it left Harding stunned and deeply unsettled. The boy spoke as if he had conducted this experiment many times before, without a hint of remorse or guilt. This growing fascination with the suffering of animals was the first sign that Timothy's nature was far darker than anyone could have anticipated. He was not simply a curious child. He was a child with an unsettling capacity for coldness and cruelty. His experiments, whether intentional or not, marked the beginning of his descent into something more sinister, and it would not be long before his interest in the physical world would turn toward the human subjects who would become his victims.
Dr. Harding's investigation into Timothy's strange behavior took a terrifying turn when he discovered the cave where Timothy had been conducting his twisted experiments. Harding had heard rumors of the cave, mentioned casually by some of the local farmers, who had noted that Timothy often disappeared for hours into the woods, always returning with a sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't until Dr. Harding decided to search the area around the Caldwell farm more thoroughly that he discovered the full extent of Timothy's activities. The cave, located a short distance from the farm, had been carefully concealed by Timothy. It was hidden from view by a thick veil of brush and fallen branches, making it difficult for anyone to stumble upon it by accident. But Harding's search uncovered the horrifying truth. Inside the cave, he found a collection of bones, scraps of fur, and makeshift tools. The bones were arranged in strange patterns, suggesting that they had been intentionally placed rather than discarded haphazardly. There were also several crude implements that appeared to have been fashioned from farm tools, sharp-edged knives, prying devices, and other instruments that suggested a level of planning and calculation far beyond what any child should be capable of. What disturbed Dr. Harding most were the drawings that Timothy had left behind. Scattered around the cave were several detailed sketches, many of them showing animals in various stages of injury and dissection. The drawings were eerily precise, with notations beside each one documenting the animal's reactions, the length of time it took to die, and the methods Timothy used to cause the pain. One particularly chilling drawing showed a rabbit in the act of being strangled, its eyes wide open in terror. Beneath the drawing,
Timothy had written, "Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat." It was clear that Timothy had been using the local wildlife as test subjects for his experiments, methodically studying their reactions to pain and death. Each drawing and note indicated a deliberate, controlled effort to understand and document suffering that he had caused. This was no innocent curiosity. It was a carefully organized catalog of cruelty, and it was deeply disturbing to Harding. The presence of these drawings and the arrangements of bones painted a chilling picture of a child who had not only been conducting experiments on animals, but had developed a dark, methodical understanding of injury and death. The cave became a symbol of Timothy's twisted nature, a place where he could explore the limits of human cruelty without fear of discovery. It was here, in the isolation of the cave, that Timothy's true nature began to emerge, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy.
As Dr. Harding continued to investigate Timothy's activities, he became increasingly alarmed by the boy's approach to violence. It was not the impulsive, emotional outbursts typical of a child acting out. Instead, Timothy approached violence with the cold calculation of an experienced practitioner. There was no panic, no hesitation, and certainly no remorse. Every action, every injury, and every death seemed to be part of a carefully executed plan. Timothy viewed violence as an experiment, something to be studied and cataloged for future reference. He spoke about the deaths of animals and humans with a chilling detachment, as though he were discussing an academic subject rather than the lives of real beings. His interest in the mechanics of suffering seemed purely scientific. He was not simply causing pain. He was studying the ways in which pain unfolded, the way life faded from the body, and the way different creatures responded to death. For example, after the drowning of Mary Fletcher, Timothy casually remarked to Dr. Harding that drowning was particularly interesting because it took longer for the body to shut down than most people realized. "It's not as quick as people think," he explained with an eerie calmness. "You can hold someone down for quite a while before they stop struggling. And their breathing, it's not just gasping. It's more like they're trying to hold on to life, but they can't." His description was unnervingly precise, and it revealed a level of understanding that a child should not have. When Dr. Harding questioned Timothy about his involvement in the deaths of the animals, the boy was completely unrepentant. He viewed them as necessary for his understanding of life and death. "I just wanted to see how they reacted," Timothy said, matter-of-factly. "It's all about learning what makes them stop. It's interesting to see if they scream or if they just go quiet." The lack of emotion in his voice was what struck Harding the hardest. Timothy didn't view his actions as wrong or even unusual. To him, they were simply experiments, part of his quest for knowledge. This cold, scientific approach to violence made Timothy a particularly dangerous individual. He was not driven by rage or hatred, but by a twisted desire to understand suffering and death. He was calculating, precise, and methodical in his actions, qualities that made him far more dangerous than a child acting out of impulse. His lack of empathy, his ability to inflict pain without hesitation, and his drive to collect data on human suffering marked him as someone with the potential for far greater harm than anyone had yet realized. As Dr. Harding delved deeper into Timothy's psyche, it became clear that the boy was no mere outlier in human nature. He was a glimpse into something far darker, a mind capable of cruelty and manipulation without any moral compass to restrain it. What Timothy had done to animals, he would soon turn to humans, and Dr. Harding knew that it was only a matter of time before the boy's experiments escalated into something far more horrific.
As the months passed, Dr. Samuel Harding's suspicions about Timothy Caldwell's involvement in the deaths and strange occurrences around Sedalia only deepened.
What had begun as a vague unease about the boy's behavior had now become a full-blown conviction that something was profoundly wrong with Timothy. Harding had observed the disturbing patterns, the boy's detached demeanor in the face of tragedy, his uncanny ability to be present at the scene of every death, and his unnatural calmness when discussing death and suffering. Dr. Harding had seen enough to understand that Timothy was no ordinary child. He was a potential danger to everyone around him. However, in 19th century Missouri, where children were still largely seen as innocent and incapable of malice, Dr. Harding knew that proving his suspicions would be next to impossible. There was no framework for understanding the kind of cold-bloodedness Timothy seemed to exhibit. To suggest that an 8-year-old child might be capable of murder would likely result in the doctor being dismissed as delusional, especially given Timothy's outward appearance of being a well-behaved, polite boy. But Harding could no longer deny what he had seen with his own eyes. His journal entries became increasingly detailed, chronicling every interaction he had with Timothy, every unsettling remark the boy made, and every strange occurrence that seemed to follow in his wake. It wasn't until Dr. Harding decided to confront Timothy directly that the full scope of the boy's dark intentions became clear. The conversation took place one cold November afternoon when Timothy appeared at Dr. Harding's office unannounced. He stood in the doorway, his pale blue eyes fixed on the physician with an intensity that sent a chill down Harding's spine. There was no hesitation in Timothy's voice when he spoke. "You know, Dr. Harding," he began, his tone casual, "I think you've figured out what I've been doing." Harding, taken aback, tried to maintain his composure. "What do you mean, Timothy?" he asked cautiously. Timothy smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that never reached his eyes. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" he said, as if discussing an ordinary observation. "I know you've been keeping track of the animals, the accidents, the deaths. It's all quite interesting, really." Dr. Harding's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Why have you been doing this, Timothy? What is it that you want?" Timothy tilted his head, as if considering the question for the first time. "I want to understand," he replied simply. "I want to see how people react when they don't know what's happening to them. It's fascinating, really. You should try it sometime. You'll see what I mean." The boy's words were chilling, but it was the lack of any remorse or shame in his voice that disturbed Dr. Harding the most. Timothy wasn't simply acknowledging what he had done. He was discussing it as if it were an experiment, a study of human behavior. Harding realized with a sickening certainty that Timothy had no empathy, no moral compass. To him, people were no more than subjects for his experiments. As the conversation unfolded, Dr. Harding's worst fears were confirmed. Timothy nonchalantly admitted to his role in the deaths of Mary Fletcher, Henrik Lynn, and Jacob Mills, and even took pride in his meticulous approach to murder. "I didn't just kill them. I made sure they suffered, just enough to see how long it would take. People are interesting when they're in pain. They try to hold on to life, but eventually they give up." The casual way in which Timothy spoke about the deaths made Dr. Harding's blood run cold. The child showed no signs of remorse, no understanding of the horror of what he had done. Instead, he discussed it as if it were an experiment, a study of human behavior. Harding knew that the boy had crossed the line from childhood curiosity into something much darker, something that could no longer be ignored. Timothy's plans for murder and the attempted killing of his aunt and uncle. In the days that followed his confrontation with Dr. Harding, Timothy's behavior grew more disturbing. It became clear that he was no longer content with studying death from a distance. He wanted to bring his experiments to a more personal level. Dr. Harding had seen enough. He knew that Timothy was planning something, and he feared that the boy's next victims would be those who had raised him, the only family he had left, his Aunt Sarah and Thomas Caldwell. It wasn't until one evening when Dr. Harding visited the farm to check on Thomas, who had injured his back, that Timothy's intentions became clear.
Harding had noticed something off in the atmosphere at the farm. The usual sounds of farm life, chickens clucking, pigs grunting, were absent, and the air seemed still. When he arrived at the house, he was greeted by Timothy, who appeared eerily calm, standing in the doorway as if waiting for the doctor's arrival. "You've been expecting me," Timothy said in his usual unsettling tone. The boy's words, though polite, sent a cold shiver down Harding's spine. Dr. Harding followed him inside, where he found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lying in their bed, seemingly asleep. But as Harding approached Thomas, he noticed something alarming. His breathing was shallow, his skin an unnatural shade of gray. Harding quickly checked Sarah and found similar symptoms. Both appeared deeply unconscious, but not in the natural sleep of illness. They had been poisoned. "What did you give them, Timothy?" Harding asked, his voice tight with fear. Timothy's response was disturbingly casual. "Just some herbs I found in the woods. They've got very useful properties. I thought they'd help with the pain." His tone was so nonchalant that it made Harding's stomach churn. Timothy had deliberately drugged his aunt and uncle, rendering them unconscious so that he could carry out his plans without interference. Harding realized with growing dread that Timothy was preparing to kill them, and the doctor would likely be next. Timothy's calmness was the final confirmation of Dr. Harding's worst fears. The boy had become a predator, and the members of his own family were now prey. Dr. Harding had to act quickly, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. The physician excused himself under the pretense of fetching supplies from his buggy. As he stepped outside, he signaled to Sheriff William Crawford, who had been waiting with deputies nearby. They had been observing Timothy's behavior and were prepared to intervene if the situation escalated. With the deputies in place, Harding returned to the house to confront Timothy and stop him before it was too late. The showdown and Timothy's arrest. The confrontation between Dr. Harding and Timothy was inevitable. Timothy stood in the middle of the room, his pale blue eyes fixed on the physician as if anticipating the inevitable clash. He was calm, composed, and disturbingly confident. As Harding approached, Timothy did not flinch, but instead gave him a smile that sent a wave of coldness through the doctor. "You're not going to stop me," Timothy said softly, almost matter-of-factly. "I've been planning this for a long time, Dr. Harding. You can't save them now." Before Harding could react, Timothy moved quickly. The boy had prepared himself, as he always did, with a knife from the kitchen. He lunged at Dr. Harding with surprising speed and force, the blade aimed at his chest. Harding instinctively raised his arm to defend himself, feeling the sharp sting of the knife as it grazed his skin. The struggle was brief but intense. Timothy fought with the ferocity of someone who had anticipated this moment for a long time, using the knife with precision and skill that belied his young age. Dr. Harding managed to seize Timothy's wrist, twisting it with all his strength until the knife fell to the floor. But the boy didn't give up. He immediately reached for another weapon hidden in his sleeve, a backup knife. Dr. Harding struggled to keep his footing as Timothy continued to press his attack with calculated force. But it wasn't just the physical struggle that unnerved Harding. It was the cold, determined look in Timothy's eyes, as if he were executing a well-rehearsed plan. At that moment, the deputies burst through the back door, guns drawn, and rushed to subdue Timothy. Despite his best efforts to fight them off, Timothy was overpowered. He didn't scream or plead. Instead, he simply sat quietly in the corner of the room as the deputies bound his wrists with rope. "You can't prove anything," he said with a chilling certainty. "Nobody'll believe that a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford, though shaken by the boy's coldness, replied in a matter-of-fact tone, "Maybe not, but we don't need to prove everything. Attempting to murder your family is enough to lock you up." Timothy's response was a chilling one. "You won't hang me," he said, almost as a prediction. "I'm too young. Someone will want to study me, you'll see." As the deputies led him away, Dr. Harding stood frozen in place, the weight of everything that had just transpired crashing down on him. Timothy's cold confidence, his ability to manipulate and deceive, was beyond anything Harding had ever encountered. The boy had shown no remorse, no fear, and no hesitation in carrying out his plans. It was clear that the boy was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, and the true extent of his evil had only just begun.
After his arrest and the failed attempt to murder his aunt and uncle, Timothy Caldwell was transferred to the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane. The decision to place him in the psychiatric institution was met with mixed reactions. On one hand, it was clear that Timothy posed a grave danger to others, but on the other hand, there was a lack of understanding of how to handle a child who displayed the kind of cold-blooded intelligence and calculated violence that Timothy exhibited. The legal system of 1867 had no precedent for a case like his, and Timothy's age worked both in his favor and against him. When he arrived at the hospital, Timothy was placed under the supervision of a team of doctors and staff, but it quickly became apparent that the boy was not like the other patients. He adapted to the psychiatric environment with a chilling ease. While most of the patients exhibited behaviors that were clearly tied to their mental conditions, Timothy was unnervingly composed. He had learned to mimic the emotional responses that would help him fit in with the staff, deceiving them into thinking that he was a troubled child in need of care and rehabilitation. Timothy showed little to no signs of the violent tendencies that had defined his life outside the hospital. To the staff, he appeared as a quiet, polite, and seemingly remorseful boy who was adjusting to his new environment. He spoke with the doctors about his past actions, often showing genuine regret for the things he had done, but his expressions of sorrow never seemed to reach his eyes. Dr. Harding, who had remained involved in Timothy's case, noted in his journal that Timothy's ability to mimic emotional responses was far beyond what any child should have been capable of. He plays the part of the remorseful child to perfection, but there is something hollow in his expressions, Harding wrote. His ability to deceive the staff with a mere performance is both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Timothy was given a routine that included therapy sessions, group activities with other patients, and regular evaluations by the hospital staff. His interactions with the staff were polite but cold, and he often asked questions about the human mind, emotions, and behavior. His inquiries, however, were never out of genuine curiosity or a desire for self-improvement. They were instead the probing questions of a manipulator who sought to understand how best to deceive those around him and maintain control over his environment. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, a new psychiatrist brought in to assist in Timothy's treatment, noticed the unsettling calmness with which he approached every situation. There is a level of control over his emotions that I have never seen in any child his age, Dr. Fitzgerald noted in her early assessments. He is not a child attempting to recover or heal from trauma. He is studying us, using our methods to his advantage. I cannot say whether this is the result of his natural tendencies or if something far more sinister is at play. Despite his polite demeanor, Timothy began to demonstrate subtle manipulations of the hospital staff, often playing on their sympathies to get what he wanted. He would charm the nurses and doctors with his polite nature, but always maintained a certain distance, as if he were studying them just as he had studied his past victims. He would feign sadness when he wanted to gain the favor of a particularly sympathetic doctor or nurse, only to return to his usual cold detachment once the staff member was out of sight. These behaviors were noted by the staff, but they were often dismissed as the result of a traumatized child learning to cope with his new surroundings. Timothy had become a master of mimicry.
His ability to replicate emotional responses to situations, despite not feeling them, made him an enigma to the psychiatric professionals. They assumed, perhaps naively, that a child like him could be rehabilitated with the right amount of therapy and attention. But Dr. Harding, who had long suspected that Timothy was far more dangerous than anyone realized, remained cautious, fearing that the boy was simply biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to escape. The journal and the escape. While the staff at the Missouri State Hospital were busy analyzing Timothy's behavior, they were unaware of the deeper secrets the boy was keeping. Timothy had a secret journal, a place where he documented his thoughts, plans, and observations. At first glance, the journal appeared to be a normal record of a troubled child's struggles. Timothy wrote about his feelings, his attempts at making friends with the other patients, and his desire to be better. But when Dr. Fitzgerald began analyzing the journal more carefully, she discovered something far more disturbing. Timothy had been using a sophisticated cipher to encode his true thoughts. The journal, which appeared innocuous on the surface, was actually a meticulous record of his manipulations, his observations of the hospital staff, and his plans for escape. He wrote about the patterns of behavior he had observed in the staff, taking note of their weaknesses, their emotional triggers, and the routines that governed their daily interactions. He was not trying to heal. He was gathering information, studying his captors in the same way he had studied his past victims. One entry, dated 6 months after Timothy's arrival at the hospital, read, "I have learned much from Dr. Fitzgerald. She thinks I'm getting better, but I'm only pretending. Soon I'll know enough to leave. I have studied the routines of the guards, the nurses, and the doctors. I know who I can trust and who will be too easy to deceive. The key to escaping is in understanding their weaknesses. Once I'm out, I can continue my work, but this time I'll be more prepared. The world will be my laboratory." Dr. Fitzgerald's discovery of the ciphered journal sent shockwaves through the hospital. Timothy's manipulations were far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. It was clear that he had been planning his escape from the very beginning, using his time in the hospital to hone his skills as a manipulator and strategist. He had learned to mimic emotions and behaviors to such an extent that he had convinced the staff that he was nothing more than a remorseful child trying to recover from a traumatic past. But the truth was far darker. Timothy had been using the hospital as a stepping stone, learning the psychology of his captors and gathering the knowledge he needed to escape. And escape he did. In the summer of 1868, Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital under mysterious circumstances. Despite being under constant supervision, the boy managed to elude the watchful eyes of the guards and escape the confines of the institution. The official report claimed that Timothy had somehow managed to escape during a transfer between buildings, but Dr. Harding suspected that the boy had engineered the entire thing. The escape was too well timed, too perfectly executed for it to be mere accident. Timothy had spent nearly 2 years studying the routines and weaknesses of the hospital staff, and when the time was right, he had made his move. The investigation into Timothy's disappearance was shrouded in confusion. Despite a search that spanned several states, Timothy was never found. The staff at the Missouri State Hospital could offer no explanation for how a child who had been so closely monitored could vanish without a trace. Some speculated that Timothy had been helped by someone on the inside, while others believed that he had somehow managed to escape on his own, using the knowledge he had gained during his time at the hospital. The legacy of Timothy Caldwell. Timothy's escape marked a new chapter in his dark legacy. Though the case would eventually fade from public consciousness, it left a lasting impact on the people who had been involved in his capture and care. Dr. Harding, who had spent years investigating Timothy's case, continued to document his thoughts on the boy long after his disappearance. In his final journal entry, Harding reflected on the broader implications of Timothy's actions.
I have spent the better part of my career trying to understand Timothy Caldwell. He was not a child shaped by tragedy, nor a victim of circumstance. He was something entirely different, an anomaly, a creature of cold logic and manipulation, with no regard for the sanctity of life. I fear that Timothy is not an isolated case, but rather a glimpse into the future, where children like him may emerge. I have seen what he is capable of, and I cannot shake the fear that one day someone will try to pick up where Timothy left off. Hauntings' journals, along with those of other medical professionals who had examined Timothy, became the subject of intense study and debate among psychologists and legal scholars. Timothy's case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of childhood, morality, and psychopathy. How could a child be born without empathy, without the capacity for guilt or remorse? What did Timothy represent in the broader context of human behavior? While Timothy's immediate fate remains a mystery, his legacy continues to haunt those who studied him. His case became one of the earliest systematic examinations of antisocial behavior in children and would influence future studies on psychopathy and criminal behavior. His ability to manipulate adults, his cold calculation, and his complete lack of empathy were qualities that would be recognized in future cases of psychopathy, making his story an important chapter in the history of criminal psychology.